It looks so sunburned still.
Or it may be live already. Hello,
Oh,
everyone.
wait. It says it's live. Great.
Okay.
Awesome. Thank you for joining us for this live recording, the first live recording of the Death and Grief Talk podcast. I am honored and so excited to be joined by Lauren Carroll and Erin Merelli. Is that correct?
That's right. Erin Merelli, you got it.
From the Deathwives. Welcome, you guys. Welcome to the Death and Grief Talk podcast.
Thank you so much for having us. We have been watching and admiring your work and everything that you teach your communities for a long time. So thank you for having us.
Yeah, I feel the same exact way. Thank you for agreeing. So let's just jump right in, ladies. We've been discussing a lot of things, but for those of the internet and my audience who are unfamiliar with you and your work, can you tell us a little bit about your backgrounds and how you started the Deathwives?
We sure can. Lauren and I come from pretty different backgrounds with regard to our approach to death work. We both come to it from grief, right? I feel like almost every death worker, if you say, what's the real origin story here? They're going to tell you about the first time somebody they love died, right? And so certainly we have that version of the story, and we have that in common with so many other people. But that compelled both of us in our own paths, ultimately, really to be here. So we certainly can lean on that. But in terms of how we made it a professional thing, I was working as a birth doula. I was volunteering for hospice. I was just looking for spaces where a community like this existed, where people wanted to talk about the end of life and death and dying from all of the different angles. How do we make it better for the person who's dying? How do we support their families? How do we support grievers in a way that doesn't feel trite and like platitudes? And I'm having a hard time finding anywhere to have these conversations, right? I'm having them most of the time, like on the floor in the bookstore. Because there's lots of good books, but where are the people, right? Besides the books. But so I start Googling it. I'm like, okay, progressive death care workers. And I find Lauren that way. And she was working as a funeral director. So I'll let her tell her side of the story. But when we first met and created Deathwives, I'm poetic and I'm ceremonial and I'm esoteric and I'm, griefy. And so I really wanted to approach that aspect of the work. And then she just taught me so much. I had, no idea about the difference between corporate funeral homes and green funeral homes, and that we could have home funerals. Like, what are you, so she taught me a lot about the practical applications of these things. And for years we were just friends. She was working at the funeral home. I was a birth doula and also a wedding planner for 6 years, which is so very similar, right? To planning. The emotions,
so true.
The timeline's different, but like the components are very similar. And so during COVID, we said, let's just teach a class. Let's just throw something together and offer it to the public. It was very inexpensive. We, like I said, we were both working in other spaces. We just had this shared passion to tell people about this. I'm sure you hear it all the time too. When people first learn about the things that we talk about, they say, wow, I wish I would have known that sooner. I wish I would have known that when so-and-so died. And sometimes they even like deeply grieve that they didn't get to manage that loss the way they would have had they known more, right? Yes. So that was all we wanted to do, was tell people what we knew. And then COVID came. Then everybody was experiencing loss on a level that we had never seen before. And we talk a lot about the general public's aversion to death and how afraid everybody is of having these conversations and how innocent they are in that. We weren't raised up in a way to do it, right? It's us now that are changing that conversation. That's, that's a cool thing, and I'm glad we're doing it. But come COVID, people were ready to start having them because you couldn't hide from it, because everywhere you looked, somebody was dying and it didn't look like there was an end in sight. And because it was COVID, we had to start doing it online instead of like renting little venue spaces. And the demand was shocking to us. We just thought we would do it here and there and everywhere. And people kept asking for more classes and more classes and more classes. And now we're a little more than 4 years in, and it's our full-time job. And we travel and teach in-person workshops. We've got online stuff and hybrid stuff. And we've got over, 17, 18 classes now. We've got a wide range of classes and everything from community level, like really accessible. We don't want anyone to be priced out of this, to certification programs.
So when I met Erin, well, I guess we'll start a little bit further back. I had a lot of death aversions. When I was young, I loved ghost stories and I had all of them. And then my uncle was killed in a car accident and that shifted everything. I was angry at death and really just didn't want it to be part of my life in any sort of way because I was so sad. And it wasn't until I was 19 that my boyfriend at the time was like, hey, I know you really don't like death and funeral homes. And like, I wouldn't even go to cemeteries at this point. That's how death adverse I was. And he was like, you could just type death certificates. We really just need kind of secretarial help here. And I was like, okay, as long as I don't have to see any dead bodies. And then I did. I had to have my first experience, and it was a full-term stillborn baby. What a first experience to give a 19-year-old, right? And so I walked out of the hospital doing something that I guess most funerals don't do. I brought a blanket for him. I just carried him out of the hospital wrapped up in a blanket because he was a baby. He wasn't something that should go in a box, which some funeral homes do. And that, I guess, was my first time when the nurse was like, oh, that's so sweet that you're doing that. That I kind of was like, this is sweet. I was like, no, this is what you're supposed to do, right? When I got in the car, after being terrified that I was walking through the parking lot with a dead infant, I like had this overwhelming, I could just energetically feel all the love in this baby. It was like filled my car. And it was in that moment that I was like, death isn't scary. This baby is not scary. I can feel how much love has been poured into him these 10 months, all these hopes, all these dreams. And now the parents have trusted me with him. Like, so I totally switched gears and I said, I want to be there for families. I want to step into this role 100%. It was like my Oprah aha moment. And then I moved to Colorado not too long after that and started working in a corporate funeral home, which was really kind of surprising. And Joelle, you probably know this, but I feel like corporate funeral homes will hire anyone. And I'm not saying, sorry out there, you're working a corporate funeral home, but I wasn't even sure if I wanted to pursue this anymore. I had just continued to do the work in my local community funeral home. And then I moved here. I was working at Starbucks and the funeral directors from the corporate funeral home right down the street were like, hey, we heard that you used to work at a funeral home. And I said, yeah, I typed death certificates and I helped on removals sometimes. They're like, well, we have an opening for a funeral director position. Do you want it? I mean, they literally, it was in the Starbucks. And I was like, are you, what? I was like, I've never worked as a funeral director before, like legit. And they were like, that's okay. SCI will train you. Like, we'll make sure that, and that was it. And I mean, I was hired as a funeral director in the state of Colorado at the time. There's no like licensing or college or anything like that. So I always feel like I was taught by every family I served because SCI taught me garbage. They taught me sales. They taught me how not to have interpersonal connections. I would get written up for having a 3-hour direct cremation meeting because they were like, why did that take 3 hours? And I was like, because these people were in deep grief and they needed to share their story and they don't have money to have a funeral. So I created the space for them. I mean, that was like what I was doing, right? And that wasn't cool in their standards. And so I think that's a lot of why me and Erin do what we do, is because the funeral industry wasn't creating space for families or their grief or what they really needed in my personal experience. And so I saw the documentary A Family Undertaking, where the family members in the community were doing all the death care. And I was like, first off, I was working in this funeral industry and I had no idea that that was possible. So I got super mad that I had not been taught these traditional ways, that I had not been taught about keeping an unembalmed body in a home. Like I was furious. And so I went back to the funeral home, and the very first family I worked with, he was young. They didn't have very much money. And I was like, we can do a viewing with no embalming. We could do this. We could do that. and I got written up once again. And I think it was probably a few weeks later that I was like, I can't stay here. I was pregnant with my son, and my morals and what I had seen year after year after year of just, it's almost like cardboard grief. I don't really know how to explain it. I think other funeral directors may understand, where it's just, okay, package A, B, and C, and also this is how you grieve. It's just like, you fit into one of these boxes, right? No, we don't fit into those boxes. So I started teaching and holding workshops on home funerals. Like, I wanted everybody to know this, and I wanted everybody to know that they don't need to spend $10,000 on a funeral, and you can make it personal, and it could be with your family and friends in your home, not in a funeral home on display or stuffy and cold. And it was when I started doing that work that Erin found me. And I think we both had that passion of like, something's kind of broken with how we do death and dying here, right? Like, this hasn't been good for a while.
Right. Well, I just remember it being shocking to me. I was so naive because I thought I gave this work the highest reverence, and I still do, but I thought this is the most sacred calling. And then when I found out, I too worked for a corporate funeral home for like 3 days. Really as an experiment. Like, I knew I didn't want to. I kept asking Lauren. I was like, why won't they hire me? Because I kept applying. This is a good story. And she was like, did you tell them like how passionate you are about caring for families? Of course. Did you tell them all of these ideas like for changing the industry? Of course. She's like, Erin, that's why they're not hiring you.
That's why they didn't hire you.
That's why.
She's like,
I was like, switch it to your background is in sales. Boom, yes, you're hired.
She said, try again for another one. And just approach it like a sales job, just sales. And I did, and I got the job, and I knew I wasn't going to take it because I knew it wasn't aligned, but I wanted to see like how this works. And it was the same thing she just said. It was a lot of like platitudes is what we do. We don't really care how the families are doing. And I want to say that with a disclaimer that there are wonderful funeral homes out there. There are wonderful funeral homes out there.
Absolutely.
People are re-traumatized by this type of an experience.
I mean, I completely can relate to that. I remember when I worked for the same company as a family service advisor, that was like my introduction to working in the funeral industry, right? Like professionally. And I remember on my first day, it was like, yeah, if you have a parent or parents that come in, even grandparents, what you say to them is you don't want your child or your loved one or your baby to be by themselves. So you sell them 6 spaces instead of 1, and you get a bonus for.
Yeah.
Like, these are people's loved ones. This is not, I understand capitalism, but this shouldn't work this way. But
it's exploitive. Right? It's not capitalism at this point. I feel like for some people, I was taught the same thing. You say, well, would you want your mom in this casket or this one? That kind of thing of like, how much did you love your loved one? How much money are you going to spend on them? Right. And that should never be the case. And so when I started seeing that it really belongs in the community's hands because you love them. I recently told this story, and I think it kind of sums up exactly why I do this. And Joelle, you probably had this experience too. When somebody comes into your funeral home that either you know personally or is maybe the mother of your best friend, you feel so honored to take care of them, right? You give them the best. That's what every family gets to have. That is their right to have that honor to take care of and love their person the last time. It was an honor for me, but I didn't know them. So when we give that back to the community, we know that our dead are being loved and honored the way that they deserve.
Right. Because what a good point. Even the best funeral director doesn't love this person. That's right. Let's get the people who love them in on this.
Right. That's such a good point. Oh gosh, that's such a good point. You guys have hit on so much, but I was telling you earlier, the thing that I love, even though I've never met you all, I feel like I've spent a lot of time with you online through social media, watching interviews that you've done. And I feel like one thing that I appreciate about you both is that you have not lost your femininity in this industry. Feminine energy, and women in particular, whether you're born a woman, identify as a woman, however you've come to womanhood is so important in this work. And I appreciate that you both still have that gentleness, that bold energy where you're receiving, but you're also pouring. Can you talk a little bit about how important your feminine energy is in the work that you do, that divine feminine energy is in the work that you do, and the way that you maintain and haven't lost that?
I love this question. And I love that that's the reflection that you see in us. So thank you for that. I don't know if it is something that is hard and intentional, which would be masculine, right? It's just who we are as people. We're intuitive. We understand our tuition as our strongest force of wisdom, right? Our mind and our cognition and the things that we learn are great in many ways, but they're not as real as our intuition is. And I think that we both know that. I think that we're both pretty deeply rooted. For me, it's up. Like for some people, they're rooted down, but for me, the tether goes up, you know. So anything that I do that's great or compassionate or deep is coming from a higher place. And I know that.
Yeah. I think for me too, I have fabulous and strong women in my own life. My mom is a hospice chaplain. My grandma has done so much work around grief, and it has always been encompassed to me as like, this is compassionate women's work. Like this has always been the job of the women in the community. And so it just feels like it's been through me, not necessarily my divine feminine energy, but everyone that's been behind me too. And then I just get to keep carrying that forward and to keep doing this work. And I recently shared, my great grandpa put together this like family history book, which is gold to me now. And one of the stories he shared was, I had a great aunt who died in a snowstorm, and they brought her body, and then they called the neighbors over, this group of women who bathed her and dressed her. And it's just, when I read that, I was like, of course, like, yes, that is how my family has done it, but that's how every family has done it. But it's always women. I mean, you can look historically, there's like the census, and then at one point you start seeing men stepping into that work. And that's when we kind of saw this evolution. It became
corporate is when the change happened, right?
Yeah, and that's why we have to embrace the femininity part so much again, because it's like reclaiming what was already our birthright to care for the dead, but really reclaiming that like you need to be gentle, you need to be open, you need to be loving. This isn't a business. It's not a business. It's community care. It's seeing each other for who we are. And I think you have to be able to love and see yourself first too, before you can do that kind of work with people. And that takes a lot of work, but it makes a difference.
I'll also say one thing we hear almost everybody who comes through our classes say is that this feels like a calling, right? This feels like something that has been put in their heart as a calling for them to do. Everybody feels that. I don't want to say that men don't feel that way in this space, but if you look at like, there's a bit of a female revolution happening right now in death care, which is wonderful. Like Lauren said, that's how it always was until a few generations back, when it became a suit and tie corporate man kind of thing. And now it's going back to the way that it always was. But it's because, I mean, it's for a lot of reasons, but it's because we've never approached it from like, okay, what's the bottom line? Let's make money. And we will make money. One of the things that we love to tell people is like, when you hire a well-resourced, good death doula, you're going to pay them probably far less than you would pay a funeral home for hopefully far better and more complete service and more complete grief support, right? So we do care about death doulas being able to make a living wage, and we certainly care about the access for the family, but it's not masculine in the like, money's in the center and let's structure all of our strategy to make sure that money stays in the center. For us, it's always been, how do we approach this from love instead of fear? You know, there's probably 10 things that come before let's talk about money. Yeah.
That is interesting. And the reason I say it's interesting, I guess, because in my funeral director mind, it is about the money, not necessarily for me, but for the funeral home, for the family coming in, a lot of times that's the first thing. And I'm pretty sure you know this, Lauren and Erin. I know you said you worked at the funeral home for 3 days, but you may have experienced that. That's the first thing people will tell you. They'll come in, and before they say their names, they'll be like, I don't have a lot of money, but I want to give grandma a nice funeral. Or it's almost like they announce the shame in the lack of money. And that always has broken my heart.
I know.
People have been programmed to think that if I don't have a lot of money, I can't have a dignified funeral for my loved one. So let's talk about money. For me, for a long time, I struggled with making money in death care because it's almost second nature to me. And I didn't realize that this is a skill, this is a gift. And that gift can be monetized. But how far is too far, in your opinion?
I feel the exact same way that you do. It comes like a gift. And so this is realization one day that it's a really tangible skill as well.
Right.
So is that your question? How far is too far?
How far is too far?
You got an answer, Lauren? I
haven't found out yet.
I mean, I think the hard part is we live in a capitalist society. So it's like, once we get to this point where we're like, that's where I'm stable, I think a lot of people go, yeah, but I could be there, right? And so for me, it's like, when I do community work, am I equal with my community, right? Or am I so far above my community that I can't even relate? So it's like, I personally don't ever want to be like a millionaire who's like, oh, she's the authority because she has money and so she knows all these things. It's like, I want this to always be accessible. I want people who have the money to spend the money. And I want people who don't have the money to have access to everything that they need so that they still have the proper funeral. They have that proper ending. Right now, most funeral homes don't have sliding scales, right? And so families walk in and they're like, okay, it's $5,000. We don't care if you have a Mercedes Benz in the parking lot or you got dropped off by Uber because you don't have a car. But for me, I think how far is too far is when you make this work, even death doulas, not accessible to everyone. That's when it's gotten too far. And I don't think it's going to ever get there. I think that a lot of people choose to do this work specifically because they've been on the other side of the coin, where they felt shame for not having money, or their whole community that they're in feels shame every day for not having enough money and that they can't treat their dead the way that they want to. And so it's death doulas within that space that are going to make all the difference. And they're going to receive monetary compensation, but it's not so they become rich. It's so that their community becomes wealthy in love and trust. And I think a lot of people have lost trust in the funeral industry. And that too, I don't know. I don't want to say that makes our work even more important, but I think it's making this kind of work stand out more of like, okay, I don't want to even give my money to these people because I don't know what's happening to my loved one. Where it's in your community, you know exactly what's happening to your person. And hopefully it stays accessible so that you don't pay thousands of dollars. I always joke, the funeral industry is the only business where you have to pay somebody a large sum of money to get your person back.
Yeah, I can understand that thought. On the other side, just thinking culturally, in my culture, in my community, which is the Black community, and again, we're not a monolith. There's several sects and several components and factors that determine where you fall within that community. But it's almost the opposite. It's almost like the community depends on us for information.
Yeah,
the community depends on us for that trust exists more so when someone passes away, because we know if I'm taking my loved one to the same funeral home that I've been going to, or my family's been going to for 50, 100 years, expectation that my loved one will be presented back a certain way. Whereas maybe I go outside of my community, then that distrust comes and those unspoken grievances. And it's just so interesting thinking about it. Like I said, I was in Denver a couple weeks ago. The population, I think your population's 80% white.
And very, very white. Yes.
Yeah. And I I had a friend or a colleague, I don't even know if I'd call her a colleague, an acquaintance that was driving me around and showing me the different areas and the gentrification. And I began to feel like uncomfortable in a level of distrust. And I asked her, where are the funeral homes? And she told me there's one Black funeral home here. And I couldn't, coming from the South, I couldn't believe that.
And there's only one Latina funeral home as well.
She said,
and there's only one Black funeral home in Colorado Springs as well. Mm-hmm.
It was insane to me just how different a short 4 or 5 hour plane ride, how different the funeral culture was there. So hearing you talk about that mistrust is a little foreign from my experience with my community. So I'm learning a lot listening to you. So thank you for sharing that. I wanted to tap back into feminine energy for a minute and talk about divination and how that plays a role in the work that you do. I know there's several tools for divination, mediumship, tarot. People have different divination gifts. You can hear things, see things, smell things, feel things. What would you say your gifts are, and how have they been beneficial to you as death doulas?
Sure. Well, I mean, I think everybody's a little psychic. Everybody has access to it, right? Our sixth sense. We are told as it gets turned off, right? I always remember like being in kindergarten and learning about our 5 senses. What about the 6th one? We never nurture that. We don't know it. And so I feel like I like came out of the closet in middle school when I read a Sylvia Brown book. Now there's so much out there on it, but at the time she was it, and I was like, oh, this is like kind of some of what I'm experiencing. Now, I never developed to her level, and I don't claim to be a medium at all. And I certainly never, sometimes I'll know stuff and I'll share that when it's appropriate, but that's not what I do professionally. But there is one aspect I will share, because there is one aspect of that I do use professionally, which is writing funeral services, writing eulogies, writing stories. We do this in a lot of ways as doulas. Ideally, we get to be the legacy doula and get to know the person, and they get to help us write their life story. And a lot of reconciliation work can go on for them. And then we get to come back and, after they've died, give their words back to their loved ones. And that's such a gift. Yeah. But a lot of times we don't, a lot of times we're hired as a postmortem doula after the case, and to do a home funeral or to do funeral services. And so when I don't know the person who died, first of all, I have so much imposter syndrome. It doesn't feel right. Like, I want to love them. I want to be in the business of falling in love with people who have died, right? But if you never met them, like, there have just been so many times I'm sitting there in this room of all these people who loved them. I am getting to my point. And you kind of have this imposter syndrome. And that's something so many other doulas have shared with us too. So to offset that, I take the work really seriously. I ask whoever my primary contact for that family is, can I speak to 5 people who knew them and loved them, and try to interview all of those people, So the point I'm getting at is, then it developed to a better place where I was writing a funeral service one day. And I just kind of started channeling. My pen is just going faster than my mind is, and I don't know what I'm saying, right? So that when you get to the end and you put your last little period on there, you're like, wonder what I just wrote. And you have to go back and read it. And I knew something had come over me, and I knew it didn't come from me, but I was still really nervous about it, because the last thing that I want to do is go and say things about somebody that aren't real or aren't true or would hurt other people, right? So that feels really tricky. With this particular case, I had gotten to know the family really well, and I understood that their belief system lined up with this. And so I just asked the mom, I said, I feel like I channeled him when I was writing. Would you like to see what I wrote? And she did, and she read it, and she was like, he was speaking through you. This is him. This is his voice. These are his words. How could you have known these things? So again, that's never something I would, put on my menu of services and tell people that I can do for them, because I don't really know how it turns on and off. But the more that I write services, and just the more that I write in general, channeling comes through. I always say, I don't really know how I feel until I sit down and write, or probably, the biggest attribute to my personal death work career up until this point has been my writing about death and dying and the experiences that I have. But I could never share those stories with my voice the same way that I can in writing. There's something about writing that is divination that just opens me up and lets it come through.
I would say too, now that we're talking, I'm like, this is why women do death work. Because we can tap into this so much easier. Erin knows I have some gifts, and I always have. And I think that has helped me create some really beautiful funerals for people. I don't know how to explain it other than sometimes I've worked with families that I can tell have a lot of trauma and they can't make decisions. And then I'll hear like a little, this song. Like I have this one that is clear. I remember it so well. It was their mom who had died and they were so upset. I mean, they could barely talk. She was elderly, but it was their matriarch. You know how it can be. And they just kept saying, God, what was that song Mom loved? What was that song Mom loved? And all of a sudden I heard Climb Every Mountain from The Sound of Music. And I said, was it Climb Every Mountain? And they were just like, oh, yes. And then I mean, my answer is always like, oh yeah, I don't, that's a great song. Write it down. Like, but I really feel like you can walk into a space, and I feel like everybody has this skill. You can walk into the space and you feel that heaviness, or you feel the lightness, or you feel the in-between. And I usually can feel that energy first and kind of decide, like, am I going to be needing to bring in more light into this space right now? And more often than not, it's a yes. And more often than not, their loved ones keep loving them and just want to make sure that everything runs smoothly. And sometimes I have no idea, just like Erin said, of like, why did I say that? Where did that come from? But it was exactly what they needed to hear in that moment. And it wasn't me saying it. It was something else. So, and I think that Erin said, a lot of death doulas feel like imposters. And I think a lot of people with gifts feel like they're imposters too. But in this human space, it is so much bigger than us. And then I think once we tap into like, it's so much bigger than us, then those human things that are limiting kind of start fading away. And then you don't feel like an imposter. Then you can live more open and freely in that space. And when you do, you're literally serving everybody, because that is the grand scheme of it. That is where we really live, in this big everything.
You're so right. You're so right. And it's like the word that's coming up for me is obedience, right? Because like you, I've had that hearing a song, or I tell the story all the time about putting the wrong color red on, even though that's what the family bought in. I added a little pink and it made it like a rosy red or pink instead of just red. And it's like, oh my God, that's her color. That wasn't what it looked like before. And I'm like, she told me to do it. I don't know how else to tell you, but this is what she told me. But for me, it's obedience, because when you're bold enough to do what you're feeling or say what you're feeling, and you don't allow it to choke down out of that fear, then it becomes your gift exercising and making room for you, because then that's your intimate connection with that family.
Yeah, you're committing to it. It's like it becomes reciprocity, reciprocal at that point. I love the way you said that.
Yes. And then it's like it opens the door for not necessarily that love, but that trust that you now have with the family, because that's such a huge component. I've worked with families that have just straight up not trusted me. And it was the most difficult experience professionally, compared to when a family trusts you and you're able to just flow. Everything flows. I swear, when I work with families or individuals, or I teach classes even now with people that don't trust me, I don't even want that that service anymore. And thank God I'm at the place now where I can kind of say, I don't think I'm the person for you, or maybe I'm not the teacher, or maybe this director would be better suited to work with you. But even saying that and recognizing that boundary is huge. I'm curious to know, what boundaries have you both had to set up in your work, and have you had to cross in your work in order to become better?
It kind of depends on which chapter of the work we're in. I think Lauren and I both look at it as like when we were working more with families and clients. And then now we teach more, right? So it's kind of transitioned into a different space. But when I was working more with families, it was always time management. I mean, I always, I've got an hour and a half and I'm in the house with them for 3 hours because it takes a little while to warm up. And now we're in a good spot. Now everybody's soul's opening up and now we're doing the real work. And shit, I got to go get my kid from school, right? So figuring out how to be there for them and for their needs without neglecting my own. Yeah, that was definitely a hard one in the early days and one that I see a lot of doulas still struggling with too.
My boundaries were definitely, they're still rocky. I had a hard time, and I think that this is part of that divine feminine part of I wanted to take care of everyone and heal everyone and make sure that they were great by the time that they left. And obviously that is so naive and so wrong and not mine to take on. And now we know, like, you can't fix grief. There's nothing to be fixed there. And so I think that was a hard boundary for me to learn, was that, like, this is not something to be fixed. I am a helper during this time. I hope my help is helpful, but it is all that I can do for them. And then I had to let it go. One of my other boundaries too was, like, it's sometimes hard not to fall in love with the families you serve and work with. And I, to this day, am still in contact with a handful because I couldn't let them go and they couldn't let me go. But for the most part, that was something too, is you get the people who would call once a month to the funeral home just to kind of check in, and they're lonely and you want to be there for them, but you have to have a hard boundary there because you can't love and want to have that ongoing relationship with every family you serve, because you need to serve the next family who needs you to be there to care and support them. So I've only had a few difficult conversations where I say, at this point, I think a professional who can continue having a relationship with you around your grief would be great. And here's some numbers. Because a funeral director and even a death doula, we're not grief counselors. We can't stay with you through your whole journey. And grief feels so isolating. So when you have somebody who sees you, who is with you in the hardest times of your life, like, I understand why they bond to us, but we're strangers to them at the end of the day. We've just been in that space of trauma with them, and they don't want to let us go. And we have to be able to be alive for our own families, for our own, friends, and to help
literally become a trauma bond,
In boundaries, I've actually a boundary that I've had to enforce is a boundary with the deceased, because one of my gifts is being able to communicate or receive communications from spirits that have passed on, right? And so I remember, and it was so naive and stupid, really, and honestly disrespectful of my friend and I. I worked in a cemetery that had a huge, actually 4 or 5 huge Jewish gardens. And we went into one of the Jewish gardens and left a rock on a grave. And when I tell you, that boy followed us home, and it was not a pleasant experience. It wasn't bad. It was just like, you shouldn't have done that. And I need you to come and get whatever you left back. And his presence did not leave until I went back and took the rock back, washed my hands at the sink in the cemetery, and then left and apologized.
Yeah. So, isn't that interesting that you knew exactly what he wanted you to do?
Oh, it was clear. It was absolutely clear. And my friend as well. But just having that experience taught me that I have to leave the work where it belongs. Yes. And I can't take on the work that is not mine. And I'm curious, and I pause for a second, Lauren, I had to put that on the screen. I hope my help is helpful. That hit me when you said that. That's it. We need to put that on a t-shirt or something. That's it. I hope my help is helpful. Yes. But I'm curious to know, do you all offer any teachings about creating boundaries or walking in your authority because I believe that this work, the work that we do in death care, we walk in between two worlds, and there's a level of authority, almost like with shamanism that comes with that, where that shit got to stay over here, and this is my real life. So do you teach about that? How do you?
Well, you're inspiring us right now.
You are.
To take a class about it.
Yeah, we talk about it casually. Yeah, we talk about it casually in some classes. We don't have curriculum like around that topic, and it is so important. I relate to the story that you told. There was a particularly challenging case, and you'll have to tell me if you've noticed this too. When somebody dies unexpectedly and they're on substances, do you feel that the ghost is a little more confused and maybe sticks around a little bit more?
I won't say confused. I'd say aggressive.
Okay. Yeah. Well, that was accurate in my story too.
Yeah.
So it was a case like that, and he followed us around for days, and we ended up like hiring some spiritual counsel to help us, because I think they have to listen to our boundaries to a certain extent, and I think that we are far more powerful than they are, frankly, when they don't have access to physical energy anymore. So a lot of it's more threatening than it is a real threat, in most cases. And so I think we can put up firm boundaries, and that can look however you want. That can just be like, listen, I see you, I don't like it. Or you can get witchy about it and, put salt around your perimeter, or put nails or railroad ties in the corners. There's so many different ways that you can establish those boundaries with them, but you do have to leave them, because if they can tell, they can see who's like little red light is on inside and who's got space, and who they can like hide, who they can jump in your little carousel and go home with you. They can see it.
Yeah.
So yeah,
we do talk about those railroad nails, girl. That hoodoo.
Yes, ma'am.
I mean, that's the thing. I think, again, why women are going into this work is because we know that exactly what you said, and we know that it's a sacred space, the in between. It is. I always want to say, it's not. You can't turn that space into a business. It is a liminal space that all of us will travel through at some point, but not everyone can walk that space while we're here. And that is the sacredness of it. And that's where you have to have a higher self. You have to have those boundaries. You have to understand who you are and who your spirit is. And I have not run into that with too many of my male coworkers in the past. But as I continue to do this work with other death doulas, first off, I just have to say, it is amazing how much we rise each other up. Like, I love this work because other women see each other doing this amazing work, and they're like, yes, like, I want to support that. There's never been competition. Like, it is join our table. We are making a difference in this world. And I don't know too many spaces that you can say that in, but I think it's because of the people who walk into this space, right? It creates that container that we're all already part of. And it can really be, I mean, that's almost a boundary too, is being in a boundary with each other, knowing that we are brave and that we are safe and that we have community in each other. Like, I know if you had a question, you can call me, no problem. And the same thing, but we're not in the same exact space, but we're in the same realm, right? And it's powerful, like, it's tangible power. And I feel like the more people that come into this space, like Erin said, it's a calling. Like, some people just will say, oh my gosh, I woke up and I was like, I need to be a death doula. I mean, it really is that big for people sometimes, but we've all had that calling, and that's really powerful. And we're all connected because of that,
Can I play with the word authority for a minute? Because you brought some things pop up in my mind. We've always said to students in class, we've said, it's weird when somebody dies, the family kind of assigns this authority to the funeral director, which may or may not be earned. Now, if the funeral director is a wise, intuitive, amazing person, then okay, it's earned. But if it's just this person that got hired at SCI a few days ago, they have the right to feel that way, right? So we tell families to own that themselves, and to think about, like, like Lauren said, the funeral home's the only place where you have to pay somebody else to get what belongs to you back, at the end. And so I'm giving them the power to have authority over it. This is your person. This is not our person. And so if they want it, right? Which it takes a death positive person. It probably takes somebody who's either had this education already, or this isn't the first time they've gone through it, right? But we don't want them to think that we have some sort of power that they don't over their loved one. We want them to be involved in every aspect of it that they want to. And really that's at the heart of it is, and this will line up with the work we're going to do with you later collaboratively, but like it should be the people who love them that are doing their hair and doing their makeup and doing their nails and doing their clothes if they want to. If they want to. We want them to know that they have the option to do it. Where was my other direction? When you said that, I was like, okay, authority. And then there was another direction. I can get it back. I don't know.
It'll come back. I'm sure. When it comes back, just hop right in with it.
Okay.
We do have to end in just a few moments, but there's so many questions that are coming to mind. But the one question that I want to ask, and then I'll ask you the wild card question at the end, is we talked a lot about funeral directors and death doulas, right? And I am just, there seems to be this, I've seen working that death doulas are anti-funeral director and funeral directors are anti-death doula. And for the life of me, that doesn't make sense, because it's like, well, don't you want not only this decedent, but this family or this community to have the best experience possible? And why can't these two worlds exist simultaneously and help each other? And as far as I'm concerned, you've done half the work for me. So
we want funeral directors to think that. And we don't need to think we're stepping on their toes. You know, I think that's some of it is like, who are these unqualified people stepping on our toes that didn't go to mortuary school, you know? But then like what we find out over and over and over and over and over is that funeral directors are often pretty uneducated on what is legal, on what can can be done. So that might be
what does a death doula do?
That might be a little of the reason that we don't like them so much, because we're like, you're representing this industry and we know things you don't know.
Right. And I think that you hit it on the head, Lauren. What does a death doula do? I think that is maybe, especially with older funeral directors, I've seen a lot of pushback. With the younger generation, it's like I call it the TikTok generation, they're a lot more informed. So I think it to me, I don't want to look at it like, well, these people hate each other, or this person thinks this person just wants money and you're trying to take my money, even though that's some of it for some people. I really think it's that people don't know. So thank you for your work and not only educating your students, but educating the public about what it is that you offer to families and communities. It's important.
Yeah. And death doulas have to have relationships with funeral homes. They have to. They can't do this work without a relationship with funeral homes. And so that's one of the assignments we often do. Well, all we have to is that they have to reach out to one of their local funeral homes, get prices, get the vibe. They don't like them, you can go the next city over. And that's what a lot of people don't realize either, is that they have so many options. They don't have to stay in their small town with the funeral home that gave them a horrible experience last time. You can outsource and have other places. And so a lot of it is a lot of death doulas trying to find those funeral homes that are like, oh, we get it. We know what a death doula is, because sometimes it may be a little too late to educate those old school ones. And maybe that just means you're not going to work with them, and that's okay.
Yeah, they can work in perfect harmony. A lot of funeral homes don't have the time or the resources, or maybe even like the skilled staff to work in the depth that a death doula will, right? Because we're getting in there. We're doing emotional work and spiritual work and physical work. And so a lot of it is outside the scope of a funeral director anyway. But we need to work with them on the more practical things. Death doulas don't typically file the death certificate. They can, but we advise against it. They don't typically manage transportation. Every now and then you get a rogue family, but typically we advise against it, right? So the ideal relationship is symbiotic with the funeral home, where we say, hey, we need to hire you for transportation, paperwork, and disposition. Death doulas aren't doing disposition, right? So we need to have this relationship, but we would like to be involved in pre-planning. We would like to be involved in bedside care. We would like to be involved in ceremony. We would like to be involved in education.
Exactly. Yep.
So my last question, ladies, and I'm so sad our time is coming to an end. It's a great conversation and it's gone surprisingly well. The live component, but what's next for the Deathwives?
Ooh,
that's a fun question.
That is. You know, so many things are on the agenda, but to be really honest, we're also in a space where we're just working so much. We're doing so much right now. It's like, how do you manage operations really well and grow at the same time in exciting directions? The travel is newer for us. We're doing different cities every couple of months so that we can offer like a in-person hands-on lab component. The internet goes a long way, but we just have to do some things with our hands, you know?
Right.
And then along those lines, we also do retreats with our alumni, and we're starting to bring plant medicine into those retreats and talking about our fear of death and doing some death contemplation and doing some grief work in that space. We're in the very beginning stages of writing a book. We don't know very much about it yet, but that's happening. What else, Lauren? Then we got like dreams that aren't founded, but those are
I think like one of our big dreams, of course, would be to open a natural burial preserve and have the water and the human composting all there and have death doula training and have a hospice. I mean, you know, that's the big dream, but pretty much what Erin said. I think we're trying to get back into communities again, go into different places. Erin's going to be teaching in Utah the end of this month in May. And then we'll be teaching a live class in September in Denver. And then we'll be going to another state. We don't know which one yet in the fall. So it's really fun to get to meet these people. Last weekend or 2 weekends ago, we did Rockaway Beach in Oregon. And I mean, every community is looking for this work. And it's great to know that when we leave these communities, now there's structure there for them to continue to do this education and to continue to share this message. So I think we'll just be doing a lot of that.
Yeah, and going to communities that want it, right? Like we went to New York City and that was fun, and there is a community there. But Utah seemed like an unlikely choice. Like, why would we go to Utah? It's because there's a whole community of people there who are leaving the Mormon church and who have only through their Mormon culture, and they still want death rites and death rituals and good care, but they want it to be disassociated from their church. So I'm going to teach them how to do it.
Wow, that is phenomenal. I don't know who I was talking to earlier, but I had a whole conversation about Mormonism this morning. So it's interesting that you say that because we were talking about someone that she knew. Oh, I know who I was talking to, but Crystal Lee. She was saying that one of her friends passed away, and I asked, was she Mormon? She said she was from Salt Lake City, Utah. She says, oh, not your typical Mormon. I said, I just was rambling. Did your thought come back, Erin?
No, I'm sorry. It's a goner. R.I.P.
R.I.P. thought.
Well, thank you, ladies, so much. Before you leave, can you please let everyone watching know where they can find you and learn more about you and the work that you do?
Absolutely. Our website is deathwives.org, and our handles for everything is Deathwives.
Awesome. Yes. Lauren and Erin, thank you guys so much for joining me. Thank you all for watching that have watched live. Their contact information will be either in the description below or the description for this podcast. Thank you so much. Live life, live hard. We'll talk to you next time.
Thank you. Bye.